Hey everybody, sorry for the delay getting started. We've had some technological difficulties. It's 2022 and things continue to just happen in the world. So this is Scott Anthony from Innosight. I'm joined by Michelle from KWM and my colleague Meredith. We are going to get started in just a second. The technical difficulties that we had, you can probably see on your screen. Those of you who are watching this live, you've got my smiling face. Michelle is going to be audio only. She's pushing every button on her camera and can't quite figure out how to make it turn on today. Michelle, maybe you'll pop up in the middle of the session. I don't know, but it looks like we're going to just hear your voice. Is that most likely?
I'm hoping the hardware failure works out that it can turn back on. I am hoping for that.
All right. Well, everybody, we're still gonna make do. We've got the time scheduled. We are recording this, so I'm hoping that a bunch of people are listening to this afterwards. We've got a lot of great material to go through, and we're primed to have a good discussion. So we will just take the technological blip as a technological blip. I will start sharing my screen, and we will go through the webinar materials. So it's 9:03 a.m. here in Singapore. This is scheduled to go to the top of the hour at 10 o'clock. We probably will aspire to end a few minutes before that, just to let you all get on with your day. Today's discussion is titled Leading Transformation, How King & Wood Mallesons Move Faster Than Disruption. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Just a little bit of introduction about myself, then I'll ask Michelle to introduce herself. I'm a senior partner at Innosight. Those of you who know and love Innosight know that our mission is to empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. And what we're going to talk about today is a forward-thinking organization that is seeking to navigate disruptive change. As I said, I'm joining from Singapore. I ran the first of these webinars last week. I was based in Boston. The temperature there was 27 degrees. The temperature here in Singapore is also 27 degrees. Of course, one was in F and this is in C, so you get short sleeves today. So Michelle, you want to give us a brief introduction and tell us where you're joining from?
Indeed. Hello, Scott, and hello, everyone. I'm joining from, I'm very happy to say, sunny Melbourne in Australia, which is nice for a change. We're having a wonderful summer, which we haven't had in quite some time. And I'm lucky enough to be the Executive Director of Innovation, and I have been since 2015 here. I'm responsible for things, I'm also a member of the firm's executive team, but I'm really responsible for things like the design and delivery of both our innovation and transformation strategies and portfolios. I look after service design, digital strategy, the application of AI, and our future readiness. I lead our KWM and I love our digital transformation strategy. And that's probably why I'm here today.
All right, fantastic. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the discussion. As you surely saw as we came in, this is being recorded and you will get a copy of both the recording and the presentation slides. So those of you who joined live and those of you who signed up for the webinar as well. We have muted all of your lines. You're just going to hear the voices of me and Michelle as we go through this. We are going to try to make this as interactive as possible. We have a couple planned breaks for Q&A and kind of off-slide discussion. So at any point, if you want to ask a question, just go to the little Zoom tab. You'll see a little button called Q&A and type your question into the Q&A function. Michelle and I would be thrilled to get as many questions as we can during the discussion. We will have a couple moments too where we will ask questions to you via the poll function and would love for you to share your perspectives. Just remember to click the submit button when the polls come in. And you can feel free to use the chat functionality. We might not be looking at it this closely as we just are going to be focusing in our material, but certainly if you want to throw anything in there, where you're joining from, how you're feeling, please feel free to do so. This is your webinar as much as it is ours. All right, so we have designed this in two main sections and then a short conclusion. The first section is going to talk about the basic problem we're seeking to address, drawing on some of the material that was shared in the recent Harvard Business Review article by me and my colleagues Pontus and Utsav, Persuade Your Company to Change Before It's Too Late, kind of an ominous title for that discussion. So we're going to first talk about the problem, then we're going to talk about the answer, how you transcend this information action paradox. So as we get into this discussion, probably good to provide a little bit of context about this organization, King & Wood Mallesons, that is the focus of the HBR article. Michelle, you want to give us just a short overview of KWM, who it is and what you all do?
Absolutely, very happy to. Look, we're a top-tier international law firm. Probably what makes us different is we're from Asia and we're designed for the world. So we've got over 2,000 lawyers That's a lot of lawyers, I can confirm. In 30 global locations across China, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, Australia, Europe, the US, and the Middle East. A small bit of history just for context. Look, historically, Mallesons, Stephen Jakes originated back in 1832, making us about 190 years old. So you could safely call us an incumbent, I think. For a series of integrations, we created an Australian national firm back in 1987. And then back in 2012, we created a combination with King & Wood, who is the preeminent law firm in China. Back in 2018, where a lot of our story will be starting today, the firm was doing very well. We were seeing year-on-year growth, and we had strong client relationships, and we're doing market-leading work.
Right, and you now begin to get into, as Michelle described, the essence of the challenge and the opportunity. In a world of change, how do you make decisions through uncertainty? And how do you deal with the fact that law firms are unique organizations? This is the way Barclay Cox, who until very recently was the chief executive of Australia for KWM, lawyers are risk averse by nature. That makes them good at what they do. They look for perfect information to make decisions. But in this environment, like in many environments, information is not perfect. So let's leave the legal services industry for a few minutes and talk about this challenge in a very different context to begin to frame it up. So I want to step back in time about 15 years now. I want to start this story in 2007. 2007 is the beginning of a big disruption in the mobile phone business. 2007, of course, is the year that Steve Jobs announces and Apple launches the iPhone, and the year where Google brings a bunch of handset manufacturers together to form the Open Handset Alliance. 2007, these are our new entrants. We've got the iOS and Android operating systems entering the market, and we've got market leaders at the time who have to make sense of this and make decisions in the face of uncertainty. How did it look to the market leaders at the time? Let's give quotes from two CEOs at two different moments as the industry evolved. The left side of the page is Jim Balsillie. Jim Balsillie was the co-CEO of a company called Research in Motion, later renamed BlackBerry. There's an amazing interview with him on CBC from April 2008, where he basically dismisses the iPhone. He's not worried about it. He's smug to the point of being dismissive. This is what he says: I don't look up too much or down too much. The great fun is doing what you do every day. We're a very poorly diversified portfolio, he says. It either goes to the moon or it crashes to the earth, but it's going to the moon pretty well. So we're just going to keep doing what we're currently doing. You know how the story ends. It crashes to earth. Research in Motion stock, despite the little bump last year, is down about 95% from when that video aired. Fast forward to a few years. The person on the right is Stephen Elop. He became, in 2010, the first non-Finnish CEO of Nokia, the leader in the mobile phone industry. As he looked around Nokia, this is what he saw just a couple of years later. We are standing, he said, after a few months at Nokia, on a burning platform. And see how stark the language gets. We have more than one explosion. We have multiple points of scorching heat that are fueling a blazing fire around us. From something where a market leader is not too worried to 3 years later, multiple points of scorching heat. Michelle, as you reflect on these two quotes, 2018, when our story kind of begins with KWM, what did the world look like to you then? Is it more Jim Balsillie or more Stephen Elop?
Funny, isn't it? I think it's a little more Jim, because I think we didn't have blazing fires. We had some really little embers starting. And so for us, what we had seen was, sustained growth year on year. At the top end, we had just started to see legal process outsourcing coming through, which for us was around starting to offer labour arbitrage for time-intensive legal activities. But they weren't really cutting it into the market at significant levels. Legal tech was starting to emerge outside of discovery for litigation, so we're starting to see that happen. And then the third thing, which was interesting, was accounting firms through the 90s, the big five back then, which was Arthur Andersen, KPMG, EY, PwC and Deloitte, made a concerted effort to enter the legal services market sort of in those early 90s. And then through the wave of accounting scandals in the 2001 sort of period, through financial crisis, which brought down Arthur Andersen, that really brought in a whole lot of regulatory reform, and that placed restrictions on their ability to offer non-auditing services to their audit clients. The reason why I mention that is because 2018, we saw the Big Four coming back, which was now the Big Four because we took out Arthur Andersen, starting to come back. But many people were skeptical because of what had happened in the previous 90s and early 2000s. So a few embers coming, but I don't think everybody took it as seriously as what they could have.
But it's all there in plain sight, and that's a very common pattern. So people often think that the struggle to respond to disruptive change is a struggle of myopia, where you can't see the disruption coming at you. But you see it here in the mobile phone business, you see it in what Michelle described in the legal services industry. It's all right there. What we have here is what I call the gallery of missed opportunities. Nokia working on a touchscreen phone 8 years before the iPhone enters the market. Kodak making an early move to acquire a photo sharing website in 2001, 3 years before Zuck starts coding Facebook, now Meta, 8 years before Systrom starts creating Instagram. Kodak is there, as the market leading incumbents always are. As we fast forward to today, this gallery of missed opportunities is only going to grow. I am personally worried that financial services companies are going to come next. Decentralized finance, the rise of alternative currencies, new payment mechanisms, and so on are all right there. And of course, many major banks are beginning to experiment with those technologies, but I suspect many of them are going to miss the big wave of disruption that's coming at them. Michelle, as you kind of ran through some of the forces at work at the industry, what do you personally worry the most is going to be the thing that legal firms are going to say, if only it was right there in front of us and we just screwed it up?
God, as the head of innovation, hopefully I don't miss it. But the three that probably keep me up at night to think about are blockchain. It is and has the potential to be a trusted digital sentinel. And if you think about lawyers and our function, we often are a physical sentinel. We hold things. We have, the final versions. You can go through an audit and see what happens. So I think blockchain definitely is one that will affect us heavily. The movement and the delivery of services historically since 1800s have been by lawyers, this move to digital delivery, and which will change the model significantly from a one-to-one, one piece of advice for one person delivered by one lawyer, to a one-to-many. And that's a really different model. And that's a whole different way to play through the market. And then the third one I think that is really worth watching is artificial intelligence, particularly for unstructured data. So machine learning in particular is one to look at. It really will impact knowledge workers and will certainly increase your ability to use. As we said, we're a very old organisation, so we've got lots of historical data. The ability to take that data and really play forward predictions. I think those three are three that I think about a lot.
Awesome. And those are three forces that, of course, are affecting a bunch of different industries. And that's why, as we look at some of the longitudinal data, our general perspective is creative destruction is only going to continue, if not accelerate. So those of you who follow Innosight will recognize the chart up top. This is longitudinal research that we have done on the average lifespan of companies on the S&P 500 index in rolling 7-year averages. This number was in the 30s a generation ago. It's around 15 now and declining. Our forecast suggests that 50% of the current S&P 500 index will not be on that index in 10 years. Organizations see this, they recognize the need to change. 72% of executives we talked to said they have to fundamentally transform their core offering or business model, but they said the fundamental challenge is getting the resources to do it, which suggests while they see the need, the conviction might not be there. Would love to get your perspective on these topics. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up a 2-question poll, which you can see on your screen now. Question 1 is, to what degree do you agree with this statement? My organization is changing as fast or faster than our industry. If you highly disagree, you're moving slower. If you highly agree, you're moving faster than the industry. And then presuming that there is some friction in your response efforts, what stops you from responding faster? And here you can pick as many choices as apply to you. Our team isn't aligned about the need. Our team isn't aligned about what to do. We lack the key capabilities to actually go and do this, or we are too busy running the engine. And I'm going to let this run for maybe about 75 seconds before I make the results live. And as we wait, Michelle, curious to hear how you would answer these 2 questions back in 2018.
In 2018, I would say we're number 2, somewhat disagree that we're that we're moving as fast as. We were trying lots of things. We were making beachheads in a number of fronts, but really we couldn't do it at scale. And that's the key element here, is really at scale to transform. So I would say we were very busy running the engine. We always had too many things to do, and we didn't have a dedicated team focusing on future readiness. And so for me, I think it's sadly, I somewhat disagree, for back in 2018, and certainly I think it's the too busy running the engine.
So let's see what our participants here had to say. So interesting, we've got a group that we can, I think, probably learn some things from. And I hope then some of the questions that you'll ask, and please, again, share questions, use the Q&A button in Zoom. We've got our first break for questions after just one more slide. So you see here that 7 of the people who responded, more than 50% of respondents, said that they somewhat or highly agree that their organization is changing as fast or faster than their industry, which is really encouraging to see. I would say if I look at large sample data of organizations we work with, admitting the bias in the sample, because they're coming to us for help, the answers generally average about a 2.4 if you make this a 1 to 5 scale. And then looking at the second question, similar to you, Michelle, the number 1 answer was we're too busy running the engine, tied with we lack key capabilities. So some interesting things for us to think about as we continue to go through the webinar. All right, one more thing about framing up the problem, and then we'll engage in a discussion and get some questions from all of you, hopefully. The nature of this problem. Why is it so hard for people to take action through uncertainty? In the article, we have a very simple way to frame this up. It's what we call the information action paradox. The basic idea here is that your freedom to act and publicly available data are inversely related. What does that mean? In the early days, when an industry is very nascent or non-existent, you can do whatever you want to do. However, there's no data to justify taking action. You're just going on your instincts. Data ultimately is generated by people taking actions, investing in technologies, launching new products, going to markets, etc. As that data becomes clearer, the high ground of the industry is taken by those people who are creating the data. When it is finally crystal clear that there's a big opportunity, that there's a market that looks exciting and so on, it's too late to do anything about it. Where this problem gets particularly acute is when you think about what you might call different thresholds of proof. An entrepreneur might have a pretty low threshold of proof, represented by the little X I annotated on the screen here. They're an entrepreneur. They're trusting their intuition. They're trusting their judgment. They're willing to act with limited data. Someone inside a large company, on the other hand, might have a much higher threshold of proof. And I'll talk about why in just a second. They're waiting until the data are overwhelming. The challenge is, if you are waiting until the data are overwhelming, you often end up on one of these, the proverbial burning platform. By the time the data that you need to change is conclusive, your options to respond are very narrow. We make heroes out of leaders who take action when they're on burning platforms, but there is no heroism when you have no choice but to act. The real heroism is having the courage to choose before the data are clear. Now, what's behind this information action paradox? Well, it basically is our humanity. We are not good at making decisions through uncertainty. We've got all sorts of biases and blind spots, the confirmation bias, the narrative effect, and so on, that make it hard for us to make decisions when the answers aren't clear. This compounds when we're inside large organizations. We have to deal with things like groupthink, where groups are bad at making decisions. We have to deal with things like loss aversion. The research shows we get more benefits from avoiding losses than receiving gains. And the bigger we are, the more we have to lose. You have to deal with subtle things like the bystander effect or social loafing, where people in groups will often not raise their hand to share countervailing opinions because it will mean that they've got work that they need to do. Or one of my absolute favorite ones, the illusion of control, where we rely on analysis to make decisions as essentially a defense mechanism to overcome our fear that we can't control the world. So this illusion of control demands additional data in a world where it will only exist when it's too late to do anything about it. This is the information action paradox. So Michelle, I wonder if you can go back in time a little bit and share your reflection the first time you saw, I think my colleague Pontus scribble this on a flip chart.
Indeed, that was my first close encounter. with the information action paradox. So I recall we were prepping, we had a board meeting that day, and Pontus came in and he'd been reading a book on the weekend or overnight. And I remember him coming in and saying, I read this last night, and there's something in this book I really think will resonate. And he called it something else at the time. And I remember being puzzled, but, you know, I trusted Pontus. So I was like, sure, good luck. Let's see how it goes. You know, it was one of those sort of throwaway, oh, okay. Anyway, the board meeting kicked off and we were progressing, and he gets up to the whiteboard and he draws this. And indeed, it was a short form diagram, so it was elegant, and it was great to sort of see something simple. But what I really noticed actually for the board, it was actually a seminal moment. I saw a realization around the room that we would have to act with imperfect data. That's very unusual for us at that time. And that was going to be okay because we were acting early enough. And I think for us, that was a really important moment. And I think it's, you know, people often talk about, you know, you can oversimplify or make things too complicated. I have to say this diagram really cut through all that. And I could see the lights turn on in the room around, we actually, you know, we have enough information. We could move forward.
You know, and that Michelle, is going to be a theme that we'll pick up as we get to the second part of the discussion and talk about how do you transcend the information action paradox. And this is a little bit recursive, but, you know, just to give a preview, one of the things we'll talk about is using models and frameworks to make sense when information is unclear. And that very model, the information action paradox, is one of the things that you can use. You can basically ask the question, where are we on this line? If you have that horizontal axis that says time, have we already crossed that moment where there's enough data that we can be pretty convinced or clear that we need to do something about things? So, you know, we have found, not just from that first scribbling at KWM, but at a bunch of other places, that is a very helpful way to guide decisions or guide discussions through uncertainty. So thank you for sharing that origin story. So we've got a question that has come in. So we've got a moment here where we will pause for questions. Thanks for submitting the question on the Q&A tab here. We've got a whole other set of content after this about transcending that paradox, so don't go anywhere yet. But we will pause here to get maybe one or two of your questions. So Michelle, the first question that's come in is the inaction rooted in not knowing what to do or not knowing how to do it, the execution? What's your perspective? I definitely have a point of view on this, but would love to hear your thoughts first. Is it a knowing problem, a doing problem, or maybe a little bit of both?
I actually think for us it was a little bit of both. Actually, I was about to say, I think it's the tyranny of and rather than all there. I think we had some inklings around when Pontus talked about things we should be doing. I don't think anyone went, wait, you know, what is this crazy talk? It makes no sense. Everyone went, that makes sense. I think there was some knowing. To the point about execution, I actually think, and I think it's probably an innovation bias here, but it's all about execution, actually, in my view. And so ideas are just ideas until you execute them. And so for me, it was about how would we do this at scale in a way that could shift lawyers who were very happy in their behaviours and very happy with the way they're working now. You know, how could we actually do that? So I think each of them had some part to play here, but probably execution was slightly more dominant.
You know, there's a line that originated, at least in my mind, from one of our former colleagues, Clark Gilbert, who used to teach in the entrepreneurial management department at the Harvard Business School. The right strategy is never more than 49% of the answer. And you have to spend the time to come up with the right strategy, but until you actually go and do it, it's just words on paper. So, you know, execution, iteration, experimentation is ultimately the name of the game. Now, I think the thing that's a little subtle here is there's some interplay between the two. You know, when you are executing something that's different, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, there's uncertainty around that as well. So you have the uncertainty. We're not exactly sure that we definitely need to take action. And the thing that we need to do, we're not exactly sure how that's going to go. So you've got uncertainty that kind of compounds together and leads to, in many cases, inertia. Because, you know, one thing human beings don't like, they don't mind change that's good for them. Change that's painful, change that involves relearning, change that involves, in some cases, loss. That can be a really hard thing. And it's easier to say, illusion of control, let's go study it some more. Let's go and run some numbers. Let's go and do some more analysis. And it's kind of like a big security blanket that goes around you because you feel like you're doing something even when you're not. All right, so I've got one more question here from Rico. Rico, thank you for your question. We'll take this one and then we'll get back to the material. So Rico says, how do I reconcile the push to generate information from testing prototypes and the information action paradox? You need time to test. So how do you know when it is enough? And Michelle, I think it's a great question in the innovation field. You know, we are taught that we need to follow lean startup and build, measure, learn and all that. But how do you know when it's time to really stop experimenting and start executing? What are your thoughts on this? And then we'll get to the second part of the webinar.
I think when your experiment tells you the difference between intent and behavior. So for me, you know, when you're testing and people say, oh, look, if you did that, I might, yes, I think I would do that. A lot of this intentional information, I think, doesn't give you enough. When you move to experimentation where people are actually using it and don't want the experiment to end, express things around, I don't want to go back to old ways of working, I think you do get that data which shows there is a behavioural shift. And for me, that's really, really relevant. I tend to also think we run quite often 3 use cases in an experiment. And the use cases are really to pull out not so much when is there enough information, but is there a scalability here? Where have we found ways we can get improvements we haven't thought of before? Where is the sweet spot with this experiment? So sometimes I don't think you should experiment to death. I completely agree with that. But sometimes having a couple of use cases using the same parameters, you do actually flush out some really interesting insights and increasing scale, usually, in my experience.
Fantastic. Well, let's now turn to our second part of the discussion, which we kind of started talking about as we answered some of the questions here. And do keep the questions coming. We aspire to have one more time where we catch them. So if you have a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, please type it into the Q&A window or into the chat. And again, Michelle and I think we'll have another chance where we can take a couple of your questions. So jump-starting transformation, how do you transcend the information action paradox? How do you get conviction before you're on the burning platform? How do you persuade your company to change before it's too late? So what we're going to go through in this section here, basically the 3-step answer that we have in the recent Harvard Business Review article. Step 1, generate private data. So you've got more information to make decisions. Step 2, use models and frameworks, as we talked about, to make sense of some of the weak signals that will sometimes exist. And number 3, hold what we call strategic dialogues to build collective conviction around the need for early action. What we'll do in the next few pages is I'll provide just a little bit more information about what each of these things are. And then Michelle will make it real by talking about what actually happened at KWM. So that's what we'll do in the pages ahead. So private data. The basic idea here is the data exists, it's out there, but it's not available in public sources, in analyst reports, in league tables, and so on. So it's looking a little bit underneath the surface to understand what's really going on. This could be going to look at research that hasn't been published yet. This could be taking your internal data and massaging it. This could be something that is increasingly possible, taking the breadcrumbs that exist in things like the qualitative data that's on Glassdoor. If you look at what Don Sol from MIT has done, looking at things like, to what degree is your company actually aligned? To what degree does your company actually follow the values it states? What is actually behind the so-called Great Resignation? If you go and take those breadcrumbs and data like Glassdoor reviews, you can find some very counterintuitive insights. So there's a lot of stuff out there that if you look in the right way, you can have much more information that can allow you essentially to shift that data curve to the left, allowing you to confidently make decisions earlier. So Michelle, curious, in the KWM case, there was a lot of work to generate private data. What do you think was most material? What had the most impact?
We actually trawled and collected and analysed a lot. And I think there is a point around having enough data also to be able to confidently tell a story. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So I agree with those points about the need for it. The one that really stood out for me, Scott, was we do financial analysis pretty regularly, as all organisations do. But what was most interesting is the Innosight did a 10-year longitudinal data review, and we don't tend to do 10 years, generally speaking. And what was interesting with that is they cut the data in a completely different way to how we would. And they cut it looking at where might disruption actually affect the firm and where could be exposed. And what that really did was it showed and drew out what we would call and what was known as the loyal middle, which was really a significant portion of our revenue and our clients, where if disruption did come in at that level, it would significantly impact what is a wildly successful organisation and market offering. And so it was a really interesting way to, the data we had, we do cut and carve it on a regular basis, but what we hadn't done was look at it with that analysis or that lens. And that was incredibly powerful. And certainly to this day, we talk about the loyal middle, and we test and learn significantly in that sector because of, you know, the defensibility around it.
And so a comment, and then we'll turn to the next part of the answer. You know, the idea that the data are there, you have the raw material to be able to do it. Often you just need to look at it in different ways. It might be, hey, can we go and talk to the customers we're serving and who are buying from us, but maybe they considered doing something else. When was the last time there was a competitive bid? Who were we competing against? What were some of the things they liked and didn't? And when we see gaps beginning to narrow, that can be an early sign that something is going on. So the general advice for the people who are listening to this is take the stuff that you already have and look at it through new lenses and see what you see. That gets to the second key thing. Can we use models and frameworks to sense make? Because we're going to increase confidence, but the data is never going to be perfect. Of course, Innosight, founded by Clayton Christensen, Harvard Business School, Disruptive Technology, and so on. One of the things that we're always looking for are early warning signs of disruptive change. In Dual Transformation, a book I co-authored with Clark Gilbert, who I mentioned before, and my colleague Mark Johnson in 2017, we had a version of this table here, which is basically our view of the early warning signs of disruptive change. I'm not going to read everything that's here because I trust everybody here can read appropriately, but I did want to call out just one of the rows that I find particularly important, and then I'll ask Michelle to comment which of these signals she found most pressing within the legal services business. The row that I really want to make sure that it catches your eye is the business model innovation row. If you ask Christensen for a regret about his research and the way that it was communicated, it was in the early days, he called it disruptive technology. People thought it was a technological issue. But the technology, he reflected, was often trivial. It could be copied, it could be improved, anyone could go and do it. The real thing that was difficult for incumbents to grapple with was somebody following a different business model, a new way to create, capture, and deliver value. So when we see someone coming into a space with a different model, it causes us to really pay attention because that can often drive real disruptive change. That can come in one of three ways. You can have someone obviate a key profit driver for an incumbent, just like Netflix did when it launched a model that had a subscription offering. The leading player at the time, Blockbuster, made its money from getting late fees from people. A subscription model had no late fees. It made response really challenging. Sometimes it can be a new way to organize and act that allows you to make money at sustainably lower price points, like the classic disruptive case study of steel mini mills disrupting integrated mills, or today, some of the pure play online only banks and how they're competing differently in that space. Finally, the entrant can reorganize the value chain and value system. This, in our view, is the essence of the Tesla story. People think it's a technological story, but Volkswagen and others can match the technology. The idea of removing the dealers, of changing the mindset and saying that upgrades are not done through hardware, they're done over the air via software, that's incredibly disruptive and incredibly challenging for incumbents to respond to. So when we see those kinds of business model shifts, it says ding, 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 we got to pay attention. So Michelle, let's talk about legal services. Which of these warning signs were most pressing to you and team a couple of years ago in the industry?
Definitely business model innovation. I think I've covered that in that the three things we were seeing was an LPO model where they do use a different model of both capturing and delivering value. Certainly the big four were also packaging services in a different way. And then of course the new tech or legal tech that was coming through certainly if it has impact. What is also interesting though, Scott, is we put this up at a partners conference, a similar table to this. And what was interesting, it was back in 2018, I think, or early 19. It was really interesting that across the room of 170 people, nearly all of them were coming up. Thankfully, not all at the same time, but not all in one practice or not all in one thing. And that's kind of really interesting in that you'll often think, oh, we're not seeing X and Y, but when you really get granular across the business, and we're quite diversified in our practices, you're seeing the market moving at different speeds, paces, and buyers behaving differently, in different markets, and even though we're still an Australian market, we're still in the legal industry, we buy across multiple, our buyers are from every industry. And so I think all of them were occurring at different levels and at different paces, but I think that was a bit of an aha moment for us as well, when we really got to the depth of where the disruption was coming from.
Well, we're going to talk in just a second about that, the types of discussion you just mentioned, the idea of bringing people together to have a data-informed dialogue about what is going on. But before we do that, wanted to ask a second quick poll question to the audience. So I'm going to launch this one now. This question is, as you reflect on these early warning signs that I mentioned here, and Michelle applied to the legal services industry, where else do you think we're going to see change over the next 5 to 7 years? Where do you see things that are on the right side of this table? So I've given a half dozen or 7 choices here: banking, education, food and beverage, healthcare, industrials, professional services, and retail. And we'll see how many of you pick different industries here. Michelle, while we're waiting for results to come in, which one would you select if you could pick one?
I'm an education gal. The reason why I say that, I think with the digital future, every single professional and those that are currently going through an education system, secondary and tertiary education, will also have the need for lifetime learning. Learning is absolutely not a static activity and won't be in the future. So micro-credentialing plays a really big part to play in the future. And I think the way we've traditionally learned and the way education has been set up doesn't lend itself well to that, and we'll need to adapt. I also think the application of learning at the time of need or interest. There is a lot of analysis, research, and certainly evidence around far deeper retention and greater skill building, rather than teaching something theoretically 3 years before you need it at the time of use. And we have applied that in a number of our initiatives and have seen an incredible amount of skill built, but also uptake. So I think education for me.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you introduced bias in our poll, but that was the number one answer from the group. And I think certainly as we look at this from Innosight's perspective, the 3 that are top here: education, healthcare, and banking, kind of house view. House view would be healthcare, is the industry globally where we see the most disruptive change, really accelerated by the pandemic, that has driven advancements in lots of places, shown that we can do distributed care in lots of different ways, and is really forcing providers to think and act differently. But education, certainly, we see lots of potential for essentially degrees to be disaggregated in the way that you described. So you can do micro-credentialing, you can have stackable degrees that come in different places, which can be great opportunities for people who are in the industry, or can be real challenges, depending, as always, on what people do. So interesting to watch it in the months and years and even decades ahead. All right, let's talk about the third component here, which you kind of hinted at when you said, we had a group of lawyers look at a version of something like this. So one of the things that we have found to be an essential tool to get conviction to act before data are clear is to hold what we call strategic dialogues. These are some of the principles to make these dialogues maximally effective. Create space for them. Make sure that you've got time to have good data-informed discussions. We call them data-informed rather than data-driven, because remember, the data are never going to be perfectly clear. But that doesn't mean you're just sitting around and making stuff up. You're generating as much private data as you can, and you're bringing that to inform the discussion. Recognize the answer is never going to be clear. So number 2, embrace creative abrasion. This is Linda Hill from Harvard Business School's phrase, and she says it is a key ingredient to innovation. Disagree without being disagreeable. As you do that, don't try to get false consensus. Number 3, try to understand the places where people aren't aligned. And as you do that, number 4, have this be a battle of an assumption versus a battle of a belief. What does that mean? A battle of beliefs is you say, I think this, Michelle says, I think that. What do you do with that? You have personalized it. Somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. If instead I say, Michelle, the critical assumption I'm making is, and Michelle says, the assumption I'm making is, You've split it, you've depersonalized it, you've created something that you can go and gather data or experiment around. It makes the discussion much more productive. Sweat the details. Think hard about what are the specific ways in which you're going to make sure discussions are as productive as possible. What kind of experiences do you want people to have? And then finally, think about how you're entering into the space where people will have the right mindsets to go and work on these problems in the right way, shedding as many biases as possible, and then exit the space saying, all right, here's where we agree, here's where we disagree, here's what we're going to do next. So Michelle, I'm curious, just as you reflect on the numerous strategic dialogues that I know KWM had, which of these things really ring true to you, or you have a story that you can share that helped to bring these a little bit more to life?
Indeed, I do. We had quite a number of strategic dialogues, and I actually do think that was part of the secret to our success was bringing our stakeholders along. So I am all in on these 6 elements. If you forced me to pick one, it's probably 5 and 6 combined in that. I recall we scheduled another board meeting to sort of finalize and sort of move into the really, we should progress the transformation strategy. It was a pretty important meeting, and it was an extraordinary board meeting in that we scheduled it just for this topic. And the board typically meets within our premise, not unusual. And on this occasion, we actually thoughtfully stepped back and scheduled it at a client's premises. And the firm hadn't done that before. And we actually scheduled it at a client's innovation lab. And so the meeting was held in a glass room, and around the outside of the room was almost, think alike almost innovation stations where they were really live products and robots and all sorts of things all around the outside of the room. And then we had periodically throughout that meeting, I think, Scott, you were even at that meeting, we paused and we went out and we looked at the various, it was like a show or a fair, if you like. We went and looked at each stall and they told us a story about it and brought it to life. Why I think that was really important is because we were talking at a significant strategic and conceptual level. And I think people understood that and got that. But when you can feel and touch things, and I think to the point about thoughtfully enter and exit the space, we selected the right client with the right type of innovation lab that allowed our partners to really experience, touch and see. And I think it took it to a different level. So for me, that would be the one that really counted. They all matter, but for that one, I think we had a really big impact on that day.
And I remember that well. And place and space, again, makes a huge difference. And obviously, depending on where you are in the world, you might have fewer degrees of freedom to do something like that today. But, think about if you're having a discussion like this with your leadership team, what other forms of stimuli are you getting? How are you going to get them to break out of normal routines? Inertia is a powerful enemy when you're trying to get people to think and act in different ways. And anything you can do to, in a dictionary way, disrupt the status quo and get people just to enter in a different way, it can pay huge dividends. All right, so Michelle, let's finish the story for KWM. So 2018, there's some noise out there. Is it real? Is it not? We go and say, okay, let's get some private data. It says that there's some real signs that there is risk here. There's opportunity as well. We make sense of it through the disruptive innovation framework. We say this fits a pattern. We hold a bunch of strategic dialogues. We say, okay, it's clear we need to do something. Tell everybody a little bit about what you did and how it's all going.
Thanks, Scott. So it has been fun, and I have to say it's been a very busy time. And the first thing I would say, or probably second now, is that it takes a village. The firm is incredibly lucky to have a seriously talented team working on this. So we've got 3 streams of work and 22 interconnected initiatives. And I think Scott's listed a few of them here, but I think each of these absolutely bring a significant amount of impact to the organisation. But I think the power is in the collective, and having them interconnected and reinforcing in nature just means that transformation is top of mind all the time for our people in different genres and different ways. Every initiative is designed to create behaviours to remove blockages. And we were really focused on systemic enablers, just making it so easy to add to your day. It's harder not to. We were over the moon in 2021 last year when we won the most innovative law firm in Asia Pacific with the Financial Times. But I think what made many of us in the team get a tear in our eye was we actually won the transformation program, won the most innovative law firm in the people and skills category. And I remember that day well. It was pretty cool. I think why we thought that was really a great day for us was it was great to have an external validation of our transformation efforts. So we're seeing the adoption and uptake of our initiatives continue to climb. Quite a number of those initiatives are outperforming our expectations. So we've really got the power of momentum. And to people who work in this area, once you get momentum, it's your best team member. Like the effort just gets multiplied at levels that is really heartening to see. And then the final thing I would say is when speaking to others across the firm and the cynics across the firm, they say, so this is their view, that we are considerably further ahead than they thought we would be for this time. So I think that's a really nice reflection for where they think we're heading.
Great, thank you for sharing, Michelle. And I was reflecting with Pontus yesterday. One of the things we were both talking about is, number one, as an advisor, you can hear from the discussion we've worked with KWM. Nothing makes you happier than when you see your advice actually put into action, and when your clients positively surprise you by doing even more and faster and more thoroughly than you thought was possible. The other thing we reflected on is, we think about sometimes the risk involved in doing new things. But a lot of what you're talking about here, a lot of what KWM is doing to really infuse technology in the provision of law, it's kind of no regrets, so you're going and trying new things, and there'll be some, usual adoption pain as you do new things. But, ultimately, you're building new skills and capabilities in the organization. And there's really no downside to that. You're not asking people to throw out the old. You're infusing the new on top of it. It's different, yes. But the risk to actually doing it's pretty low. The risk to not doing it, on the other hand, is extremely high. It's a mistake that we often make. We think that the biggest risks are the risks that we take, but the biggest risk for most organizations is standing still. All right, so we've got time for one or two more questions before we provide our summary reflections. There was a great question that came in as we were going through some of the discussion, Michelle, that I thought was a good one to start with, from Irene. Thanks, Irene, for your question. And again, last chance, anyone, if you want to get a question in the Q&A tab or the chat tab, please go ahead and do so. Irene asked, how important is psychological safety in introducing innovation and execution? So Michelle, what is your viewpoint on that?
I think psychological safety is incredibly important. I think it's a great insight to pull that out, Irene. I think you can create psychological safety in many ways. The traditional ones are no doubt obvious to people, but the way that you canvass ideas, or the way that you share them and test them, the way you seek feedback, the way you respond to questions or ideas that perhaps may not have merit. There's a lot of ways to really think that through. And I think it's really important to signal that this is an open space, and, all bets are off, ask anything you want, suggest anything you want. Having that type of mindset and truly signal and do that is really important. I think in the early days, people were concerned about, what are you planning? So for example, the firm has a superhero, the first ever. It's called the Multiplier, and that's pretty. If you think about a law firm, I don't know how many of you know law firms well, but I don't know how many law firms you know. And you could ask them, do you have a superhero by any chance? And their answer, I'm pretty sure, is going to be no. And that's a pretty crazy idea, right? And so when we introduced it, the way we introduced it, the way we discussed it, the way it was positioned, it got up and people love it. And we talk about the Multiplier all the time. And in fact, it's one of our highest performing initiatives. And our competitors talk about it. So I think you're absolutely right. The psychological safety is important, but you can create environments to encourage that. I think letting ideas in the wild is trickier. I certainly think creating environments to accept, discuss, and manage ideas is certainly the way to go there.
Just a couple quick points for me. So, psychological safety, I think, well proven as critical for all of this. There's a reason why Amy Edmondson, who discovered psychological safety in her research a couple decades ago, was recently named the world's most influential thinker by Thinkers 50 because of the importance of that concept. I would then reaffirm this idea of battles of assumptions versus beliefs. It's one thing that we found to be a very simple way to create more safety for discussion, because you are depersonalizing things. And then the third thing I just ask everybody to consider, Michelle said we had a superhero, and that feels countercultural. Often the thing that holds us back is an assumption that we don't realize we're making. And one of the things the pandemic should have made very clear to us is many of the things that we assert as fact are actually assumptions. You go back to March 2020 and say, we're going to disperse knowledge work overnight and keep productivity up. We're going to put patchworks of regulations around the world that restrict movements, and supply chains are still going to function. We're going to develop efficacious vaccines to a coronavirus by the end of the year. Impossible, everyone would say. Turns out it was. So you have to always ask yourself the question, what is the assumption that we don't realize that we're making? All right, let's get one more question here. I see there are other ones that have come in that we're not going to have time for, but we will, as we summarize the 2 webinars we've done, we will take all questions and make sure that we get them out to you in event reports. I think there's a great question here, Michelle. How do you balance avoiding the burning platform and changing before the threats arrive, and measuring the impact of the new initiatives? And I'm reminded as this question comes in, Clark Gilbert, the co-author of Dual Transformation, one of his basic mantras when you're working on new things is you have to deliver results. People sometimes think new disruptive ideas or science experiments, it doesn't matter, you're just having fun. Yes, have fun, but make sure you've got measures and metrics for them, and make sure that you are crushing those measures and metrics. But curious, Michelle, if you have other thoughts about this, balancing avoiding the burning platform and measuring the impact of new initiatives. Maybe a minute or less response, and then we'll provide our parting thoughts.
I think you nailed it, actually, Scott. It's critical to have data to be able to tell a narrative and a story, and that story has to capture the hearts and minds of your people to the point about the impact and the burning platform point. It needs to be one that you can tell a story about, but the data needs to be validated and stood behind. And I think being able to track and measure progress, being able to pull out client testimonials, being able to show the market where you're moving, really critical. So great question. I tend to not use the burning platform very often. I don't love fear as a motivator. I'm really about being ahead of the pack. So for me, the psychological safety piece comes up in there. For me, I'm much more about motivating to get ahead rather than through fear.
Awesome. And again, there were a few other great questions that came in that we're not going to have time for, but watch for them in the summary that we produced for these 2 webinars we've run on the article. All right, so let's end with a few closing reflections. I'll go through 4 points here and then ask Michelle to comment on it, just to tie together the threads that we talked about during this discussion. And thanks, you all, for your participation, for your great questions, for participating in the polls. I think this has been a really great discussion. Point number 1. By the time the data are clear, it is too late to act. If we wait for perfect data, we will have no freedom to act. Let's not make heroes of people who act when they're on burning platforms. There's no heroes in there. And to Michelle's point before, the research in fact shows the burning platform metaphor is not a very helpful one. Fear does not motivate response. Fear leads to people being very myopic and very closed down in what they're trying to do at a moment when you really need them to innovate, growth mindset, and think about different things. So let's not make heroes of people who act on burning platforms. Let's make heroes out of people who never end up on a burning platform. You heard the answer: private data, interpretive models to make sense of that data, and strategic dialogues to break and transcend the information action paradox. And as a leader, build your capacity to confront these challenges by regularly living the William Gibson line: the future's already arrived, it's just not very evenly distributed, and experiencing tomorrow today, touching and sensing new technologies and new developments. So you've got that intuition to make decisions through uncertainty, and build what the poet John Keats in 1817 called a negative capability to live in mysteries, uncertainties, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Get really good at watching. You've got 2 eyes and 1 mouth, 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in proportion. Make a habit of pausing, get off of the dance floor, go to the balcony to make sense of what's going on. And instead of seeking answers, ask really good questions. Those capabilities will help you to make sense of the swirl of uncertainty. Michelle, final word to you, just as you reflect on the KWM journey, what final thoughts do you want to share with our audience?
My reflection from those 4 points would be number 3 for me, private data in particular. So we design data collection at the same time we design every initiative. We do that so we can show the baseline of where we started and the progress made, meaningful progress. So it's not gut, it's not we think that, we're using really hard data and we use that data to headline our stories. Now we're moving from, for many of our initiatives are moving from executing to embedding. Data is even more critical. We use it to show precisely where we need to focus more, nudge often and lean in. It's critical. We all have finite resources. Converting effort to impact remains just as important today as when we started this journey back in 2018.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We're inspired by the story of KWM, and we know the journey is still in its early days. We know there's a lot of things that have to happen, but on behalf of the entire Innosight family, appreciate you joining and sharing these insights, and thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. It's been a great discussion. Enjoy the rest of the day or evening for those of you who joined from the United States. Take care now.
Thank you.